Okay, so we're going to travel through the GI tract, one organ at a time, and point out the structures that you should know. Oral cavity is where we will begin. Few structures that I want you to know in the oral cavity. Lips are probably obvious. We know what those are. Teeth. In this class, we're not going to dive in deep to the different types of teeth and their anatomy. We just know those teeth are involved in mastication, along with those muscles of mastication. Gingivae, also called your gums. That's like a kind of common term that you might hear. And yes, you should know the technical term gingivae. So that would be this pinkish tissue around the base of each tooth here. That's your gingivae. And you may have heard of this in the context of gingivitis. I know there's a lot of dental products, and you hear commercials for products that might help with gingivitis. So, gingivitis would just be if we added itis at the end here, that would be swelling of your gums. So, you got some sort of perhaps infection, something like that. The tongue, also probably well-known structure here. Your tongue has a lot of functions, moving food around being one of them in regards to digestion, and getting that bolus ready and pushing it back. The hard and the soft palate. So broadly speaking, palate refers to the roof or the top of the oral cavity. It also can be thought of as a wall between your oral cavity and your nasal cavity. So if you look over here, this is like a sagittal cross section of your oral cavity, and nasal cavity would be up here. Can't see many of the details, but we know it's right above your oral cavity. The hard palate would be the portion of this wall that contains bone. So the hard palate, it contains parts of maxilla and palatine bones, and it is the anterior part of your palate. In your posterior, the soft palate. Important to realize, and we'll get to this when we get to swallowing, is that the soft palate can be lifted and close off the nasal cavity. Uvula would be this little ball that you can see when you open your mouth wide, and it's hanging off of that soft palate. The lingual frenulum, and I don't like that your book made the tongue going off to the side here, because it makes this frenulum, this little strip of thin tissue that anchors your tongue, it makes it look like it's only on one side, when in fact, it does go straight down the center. And of course, it would move with the tongue. Interesting little aside, if you've ever heard an infant that's born tongue-tied, which sometimes happens, this lingual frenulum is too extensive, and then it's hard for the babe to lift the tongue. You usually just snip a little bit of that thin lingual frenulum. All good. The kid's fine. I'm going to mention the tonsils, but I don't test on the tonsils. I know that they're brought up, I believe, in lab during this organ system. You do have various tonsils in your oral cavity, also up here as part of your nasopharynx. Palatine, you can't see them very well in either, but tucked in your soft palate, you've got some tonsils. Those are all lymphatic tissue, so part of your lymphatic system. So not really technically part of the digestive system. What we think they're doing is just kind of sampling things that you have inhaled or ingested. And if they happen to have some sort of pathogen, that will be like your first line of defense that will alert the rest of your immune system. And if you do have certain infections, can cause these tonsils to swell. And if you've ever seen them, they're quite distinctive. They're kind of white with red flakes. They're white because there's lots of white blood cells, but you can see in somebody who has certain infections, they'll do this. They'll get this massive swelling of those tonsils. But again, not part technically of the digestive system, so I will not expect you to know them for this chapter. Salivary glands. These I do want you to know. So these are glands off of your oral cavity, and they all have ducts that, of course, would secrete saliva into your oral cavity. And there are three sets that I want you to know. The big parotid gland is the one that is just superficial to your masseter muscle mainly. It's just anterior to your ear. That's your biggest salivary gland. You also have submandibular. These are glands that are underneath your mandible, and then sublingual underneath your tongue. And I say that these are sets of glands because you have a left and right of each of these. So you do have a total of 6 salivary glands in your oral cavity. And then I want you to know what's the function of saliva. First of all, when you want to make a bolus, you need that saliva, that moisture to actually make all of your chewed up food matter stick together into a nice chunk or blob that could be easily swallowed. As an example, how important saliva can be to making a bolus. If you've ever tried to eat a really dry cracker when you're dehydrated, how hard it is to swallow that. That reflects your function of saliva. Saliva also will lubricate the bolus so it more easily can slide down your pharynx and eventually into your esophagus. And then finally, really important one, chemical digestion. So your saliva is mostly water, but it contains a lot of other things, including some enzymes. And you do not need to know which specific enzymes, but you do need to know there are enzymes in your saliva that will start the process of chemical digestion, and it'll break down some of the molecular bonds of some of the food that you've eaten. Swallowing is a complex and incredibly important process. There are people who have difficulty swallowing for a variety of reasons. I will give you just one quick example. Sometimes people who have a stroke or other neurological problems, especially among elderly folks, they can have difficulties swallowing. And actually, interestingly, the hardest thing to swallow is liquid. So if you have somebody who has some difficulty swallowing, you often have to add some sort of thickening agent to water. It's like a powder, and it turns the water into, it's kind of like Jello, like a gel. That's apparently a lot easier to swallow if you have some difficulty swallowing. So swallowing is this kind of complex series of events, and various structures do various things. And I'm going to have you know just the basics of swallowing. And well, I guess we could start with what's the function. Swallowing, quite simply, is this process or mechanism. You got to move the bolus from the oral cavity through your pharynx and into the esophagus. Just to remind you, pharynx is that, I think of it as your throat. It's a tube in the back behind your nasal and your oral cavities, and it's a shared tube that both food and air are going to pass through. And of course, one of the main goal of swallowing is to get that food or liquid into esophagus and not into the trachea. So after the pharynx, the air would go into trachea, your food and water should go, and other liquids should go into esophagus. So that's the point of swallowing. Get things in the food tube, not the air tube. First, push the bolus towards the back of your oral cavity. This soft palate is going to lift, and I should pick a different color that shows up a little better. Your soft palate actually lifts and closes off your nasopharynx, so you don't have food and liquid going into your nasal cavity. That would be bad. In fact, they show it over here. The soft palate has sealed off your nasopharynx. Other important things. This piece of cartilage, the epiglottis, will end up bending over and helping protect the larynx, which would be the next part. Actually, I was wrong. I'm sorry. I said into the trachea. You want pharynx into the larynx, and then, which is strictly airway, and then onto the trachea. Anyway, so your epiglottis is going to be one of the things that's going to help protect your larynx or your airway. It's going to fold over. Another thing that's not really illustrated here, but is very important to protecting your airway, you can kind of see this slit here, right there. Those are your vestibular and your vocal folds. Yes, the vocal folds can produce sound, but the other thing the vocal folds can do is they can close off completely, which is what happens when you say hold your breath. But they will close off completely during this whole swallowing mechanism as well, and they're closing off to try and prevent, again, any food or liquid that might have slipped past, prevent that food and liquid from continuing down into your airway. So vocal folds will close, and I know that's not on your books list, but it is important. List of things that happen. Vocal folds will close, or the other way we think of it is adduct. So the two folds will come closer to the midline and close off the airway completely. Another important thing that happens that your book did not do a great job of illustrating is the movement of the entire larynx. So when you swallow, this whole set of structures, your larynx, that you would have learned in respiratory system, like your epiglottis and your thyroid cartilage, this entire set of structures is attached to a bunch of muscles. You can kind of see a little bit of them right here in the floor of the oral cavity, but there's others as well that aren't really illustrated in this sagittal section. But all those muscles will work together to pull the larynx anteriorly and a little bit superiorly, kind of like those two directions. And what they're doing is just, what it's doing is kind of tucking this entire airway a little bit under your oral cavity. And that way, you're going to have clear, direct pathway for the food matter to end up in the esophagus instead of in the airway. So this pulling of the larynx, anterior and superior, you can see this really well, or you can feel it on yourself. You can look at someone and see kind of their whole thyroid cartilage bobbing around in there when they swallow. That's this mechanism of pulling the whole larynx forward and superiorly to try and get it out of the way of the bolus or sip of water that you've ingested.